Okay. So thank you for having me here tonight. I'm going to start tonight with a bit of geomorphology. I'm going to go through a bit of history of the estuary and how the system functions. And then I can move on to the what's next, because it's important to understand that context of what next. We have to understand where we've come from. Not everybody knows, or not everybody remembers, that the Tamar catchment is really quite large. It's more than 15% of the state drains through the Tamar catchment. We've got 9 municipalities involved in the Tamar catchment. It's a whole lot of land uses in there. There's agriculture and forestry. We've got urban areas, native forests, fisheries and aquaculture. There are 5 major river catchments. The North and South Esk are probably the obvious ones, but then we've got Meander, Brumbies Lake and Macquarie. So water from the Central Highlands, particularly Arthur's Lake, comes down through Powhatan and ends up coming through the South Esk and Trevellyn Dam. About 30% of the water that goes through Trevellyn Dam is Brumbies Lake water, or Central Highlands water, and it would have gone to the Derwent, but we got it instead. It contains Tasmania's longest river, the South Esk River, so 214 kilometres of South Esk ends up here. So if we get rain at Grey, then 2.5 days later it ends up running through our city. And the Kanamaluka Tamar is very long estuary, and it's Australia's second longest estuary. I think one of the alligators in the Northern Territory is a bit longer, but it's long. And there it is, all 70 kilometres of it. NRM North divided up into functional zones because of, it's very long, and they're really quite diverse habitats between the upper estuary where we are and the mouth down the bottom. Now, an estuary is the place where the river meets the seas, where the freshwater and the saltwater meet and then mix. For us here in Launceston, the estuary comes all the way up into Launceston and through Launceston and really all the way out to St Leonard's. So when we have low summer flows and lots of saltwater pushing up estuary, then we get saltwater wedges going a long way inland. I always like to call Kanamaluka Tamar an estuary. I usually drop the river bit out, even though that is part of the gazetted name. I drop it out, and I do that on purpose because I think it changes the way that we think about this system. Rivers flow in one direction. They flow downhill and out to sea. Estuaries come in and out with tides. So they push back up. So if you put something in a river, it will go downstream and out. But if you put something in an estuary, it will go downstream a bit and then come back up, and then it will go down maybe a bit more and come back up. And so it changes the way that we think about these systems when we use the right terminology for them. So in this estuary, with that incoming tide that pushes things back up and it pushes the salt up, it stops the sediments and the clays and the sands and gravels that would normally flow downstream. It traps them in our upper estuary. Our incoming tide is stronger than our outgoing tide because of the way that the tide amplifies up the estuary. So it's harder for water to get out. Things get locked up in here. And then with the salt, you get a chemical process where the clay particles bond together and they flocculate and they get heavy and they settle out. So we have mudflats in Launceston, and that's an entirely natural state. The Kanamaluka Tamar estuary is a drowned river valley. It was flooded by the sea about 6,500 years ago when the sea level came up and pushed the salt inland. And the natural state of these systems is to be alluvial floodplains that slowly fill in over time and become meandering rivers. And you can see, I hope you can see that. That's quite pale, isn't it? But I hope you can see that in the topography. So the grey lines, no? So the grey lines are our hills here, and this broad sway through here. This is our floodplain, or what's left of our floodplain, because we've wiped out quite a lot of it in the last couple of 100 years. But this is the meandering North Esk wandering through here, and this is our city and Invermay, all built on floodplain and what would have been intertidal swamp once upon a time, which is why Invermay people are called swampies, and Dry Street is called Dry Street because it was a little bit higher and didn't get wet, which is just here. That's that little bit of extra elevation in through there. So that's the natural state of the system. We've changed it quite a lot. We've taken water out, we've infilled wetlands, and we've stopped some of these intertidal flats from being able to flood. That's changed the tidal prism, so it's sort of moved, it's moved things around a bit, but it's in general roughly the same as it ever once was. We don't much like the exposed mudflats at low tide here in Launceston, and if you go back through the historical record, since European settlement, people have never really much liked the exposed mudflats in Launceston. Then it was mostly about people running aground because it was quite shallow, because that's the nature of the system, to fill in with silts. But also, for us living here to now, we've got a bit of a collective amnesia about what the system should look like. So for a long time it was dredged, for a long time there was no silt or no sediment, no mudflats. And we forgot that that is perhaps the natural state of the system here. Also, because of the geomorphology of our system, a drowned river valley, our mudflats are a long way inland. They're 70 kilometres inland. The Inglis River on the northwest coast, the Blythe, Pipers River, their mudflats are all at the coast, and that's where we expect them to be. Intertidal mudflats, intertidal sandflats are at the beach. That makes sense. Ours is not like that. Ours is a long way inland, and it's in the middle of a city, and we don't love it. There isn't really anyone alive who would remember the Tamar, Kanamaluka mudflats in their natural state. But if we have a look at the chart drawn in 1833, which is over here, we can see that it's pretty similar to an aerial photo that was taken in 2018. Now, we've infilled all of this Royal Park, we've lost all this swamp through here and all that area that would have been intertidal once upon a time. But we've got this channel coming down through here, which is roughly where this channel is. We've lost all of this, of course. This has all been filled in, so reclaimed a lot of the foreshore. But it's swamp, bars and rapids and mud. It's really similar to what we had. What we've got now is really similar to what we had all the way back then. So the mudflats aren't necessarily a problem that need to be fixed, which is what a lot of people would like to do. When we think about the mudflats in Launceston, we often think about this picture. This is one that comes to mind. We see this picture come up fairly often in debates. It's taken at the 2011, so the end of the millennium drought, when we had low flows and a lot of salt water pushing up. It's pretty unattractive. It's taken at a very low tide at a very low angle, so it's not showing the estuary in all its glory. And this is another image that we see a lot, which is boats, yachts stranded on mudflats. You can't get to them, you can't use them. And this is one of the other images that people think of, the Trevellyn Dam. And a lot of people would equate the building of the Trevellyn Dam and the loss of the flow through the South Esk River down through Cataract Gorge with the accumulation of the mudflats. And to some extent they're right, because when the dam went in 1955, it wasn't very long after that we stopped dredging. And so it's actually a little bit more coincidence, or quite a lot more is coincidence rather than actual causation. Because we know the mudflats were there in 1833, and we know that people were worried about the state of the foreshore before the dam went in. So this is from 1950, 5 years before the Trevellyn Dam was built, and it made page 4 of the newspaper because Burrows was so horrified by the stinky, awful mudflats at the Henley Regatta. And it says, he was struck by the silt lying off Royal Park near the end of the Margaret Street sewer. We also know that we're not the only intertidal marina in the world. We're not lone rangers when it comes to having boats stranded in low tide. Cornwall, Yorkshire, Jersey, the Tamar in the UK, really similar systems. It's probably how it got its name. They've all got 3.5 metre tides. Nova Scotia's more like 9. So people all around the world have to put up with intertidal mudflats, and a lot of places they just put up with it. What about the beach? A lot of people like to say. There used to be a beach at Royal Park. I remember we used to go down there and there was white sand at the beach. There are areas of sands and gravels that are naturally occurring around the upper estuary. There's a little sandy gravelly island off Rupert and Hound, I think it is, the restaurant's called now, at Seaport. But this beach was not a natural beach. This was imported sand. And so here is an article from 1923 in the local newspaper. Another attempt is to be made to make a beach for the benefit of the children at Royal Park. Some years ago, a large quantity of sand was carted onto the foreshore, but it washed away again for the reason that no provision was made with a view to keeping it there. So we've been making a beach at Royal Park for a very long time, and it's another example of our collective forgetting. There would be people here who are probably old enough to remember playing on the beach at Royal Park. They remember the sands that were there. They're not naturally there. And as a child, you wouldn't have known that they were brought in because you just went to the beach. Your parents took you to the beach and you played at the beach. But you were playing at a constructed beach beside a raw sewerage outfall. So, a lot of people don't like the look of our foreshore when the tides go out. And I think this is another collective forgetting. This is not very long ago. This is 1999. Can anybody have a crack at where that photo was taken from? There should be people here who would know roughly where that photo was taken. Yep.
Looks like Home Point.
Yep. So we're probably standing somewhere near the Tamar River Cruises or the Sea Scout pontoon, looking upstream towards the bridge. So here's there's the bridge. So when I was growing up, nobody went down to the foreshore because why would you? It was rusty old hulks, that big ship there. I mean, that sat there for all of my childhood that I can remember. So nobody went there. It was weeds and industrial and water rats was probably about as good as it got. And now it looks like that, which is not so bad, really. I mean, I know that's at night time and the tide's in, but even when the tide's out, it's not so bad. You go down there at any time of the day and there are hundreds of people walking along the foreshore. They're walking along here and they might go over the bridge to the park, they might stop at Mud and have a glass of wine, they might go to the silos and have a nice meal, or they might just do a lap with their kids and their dogs. But it's really a lot better than that. And that was not very long ago, and I think we've forgotten, even in 20 years, that was the heart of our city 20 years ago. So I've got one more misconception before I move on to a bit more about sediment, and that is the combined system, because that one gets a run pretty often too. This was an article from 2016 that we had more than 1,200 overflows into the Tamar. We've had our premier, so that we've had 1,000 sewage spills in a year, and it's unacceptable and it's third world. And when we talk about 1,200 overflows, we're talking about pump starts. There are 15 combined system overflow sites around Launceston, and each one of those has multiple pumps inside it. So Margaret Street has 8, I think, big pumps inside it. So every time one of those pumps turns on and turns back off again, that's a pump start. So that's one in that 1,200. And if you've got 8 pumps and they're turning off and on all day because it's raining a little bit and they're pumping little bits of water out, you might have 50 or 80 pump starts in a day. That's not 50 or 80 sewage overflows. It's really one event because it's on one day. But the way it gets reported makes people really upset and cross. And there aren't 1,200 days in a year, so I don't quite know how we can have 1,200 sewage spills, but That's the way it gets reported, and it makes us like our estuary a little bit less when we talk about it like this. We have to have those pump stations because we have a combined drainage system, but we also have a bowl inside a bowl. So this is 1991. This is rain in Margaret Street. There was a bit of a zipper cloud, a cloud came over and it unzipped and it dropped its load right on the centre of the city. It's something like 11 mils of rain caused this flood event, and people were walking around in knee-deep water in the middle of the city. So we have to have those pump stations because we live in a city that looks like this, because we built it on a floodplain. So the city is below high tide, it's below the flood levels. So we've built these walls all around the city, these levee banks all around the city, and they keep the high tides out of Invermay, and they keep the floodwaters out of the CBD, and they keep us safe. But when the rain really falls on Margaret Street or Wellington Street, we end up knee-deep in combined sewage and stormwater, which is not very nice. So we have to have pump stations because the water runs down the hill and it hits these lumps, these levees. So we have to pump it out over the levee to get it out of there. The way combined drainage systems work is when you have a bit of rain, the stormwater and the sewage goes to the treatment plant. If you get enough rain falling that it overtops a weir, or in our case fills up a wet well that triggers a pump, then you get a mixture of sewage and stormwater discharging to the estuary and a mixture of sewage and stormwater still going to the treatment plant. And they work really well because stormwater is really filthy. There's nothing clean about stormwater. It carries all of the dog poo that people didn't bother to pick up, and cigarette butts and Coke cans and lolly wrappers and leaves and sticks, and all of the stuff that's on our street is in our stormwater. When it rains a little bit in Launceston, in the centre of town, all of that goes to the sewage treatment plant. At the very worst, it goes to a pump station where all the bits get screened out, all the lumps and cans and things, they get all the dirt, all that gets screened out. So in that situation, it's actually better for the environment than a separated stormwater system, because in Kings Meadows catchment, all of that stuff ends up in Kings Meadows rivulet, and from there it ends up in Queechy Lake and out into the North Esk River, and there's nothing between the streets of Kings Meadows and the North Esk River. So combined drainage systems can be really good. Ours is a little bit overwhelmed. We've got a lot more hard surfaces in the middle of town now, so water hits it a little bit harder and faster, and the system gets overwhelmed a little bit more often. So that's where that River Health Action Plan money and the combined sewerage plan will kick in to try and reduce some of the times that this system overflows. And they're not third world. We are the only one in Australia, really, that's left. Ours is built in the 1860s. There were some in Sydney that have since been removed because they're a big city and they can afford to dig things up and bulldoze whole blocks at a time. We haven't done that here, so we still have our combined drainage system. But so does New York and Paris and London, so does 700 cities in North America. They're not third world, it's just a different way of handling stormwater and sewage. This, I guess, goes with the combined system work. When we hear people talking about how our water quality is very bad and how they used to swim at Royal Park at the beach, but they were swimming next to a raw sewage. This is thermotolerant coliform, so this is an indicator of fecal contamination in the water. I've had to chop the top 80% of this chart off, because if I kept it on there, you wouldn't be able to see any of the trends that are happening down the bottom, because we were getting counts in the millions. We're now down into the few thousands with all of the improvements that have happened to our sewage treatment plant and our stormwater network, from Tea Tree Bend in 1972 to the Margaret Street Detention Basin in 2003. The last big awful water quality was right before Hobbler's killer fatty hooked into Hobbler's Bridge. So before, in the early 90s, when we got really big spikes, they almost always coincided with the sale day at Killafatty sale yards, when they would then hose everything out straight into the North Esk River, where it would hit the centre of town the next day and make it a pretty nasty mess. And I went there in year 11 to do some environmental science, and we had to put our hands in it. We didn't even have gloves, no such thing as health and safety back then. So we all came out with a nice ring of slime around our hands, where we'd been filling up bottles in the North Esk River outside Killafatty. And all these improvements also take a lot of sediment out of the water. Most of our pump stations, except Old Margaret Street, have gritters on them, so they capture all that sediment. The places where sediment doesn't get captured is in our separated system, and we have a lot of sediment run off our urban network into the stormwater in Launceston, which ends up on our foreshore. So this is just unmitigated sediment runoff. We have 1% of the land mass within our catchment. We have 18% of the sediment runoff comes from the urban area. And that's because we have builders who seem to think nothing of churning up parks in the wet, because it's easier to get their concrete truck through a park and track mud everywhere than it is to put the slab down before you build the house, the slab for the shed. So the urban area is really overrepresented, and everybody who builds something has, I think, a responsibility to make sure that this doesn't happen. And this can be front lawns as well. People who reseed their front lawn and then it rains, all that soil ends up in the stormwater. So, to sediment, which I'm assuming a lot of you came here to hear about. We have sort of 4 distinct periods of sediment management in the upper estuary. Up until about 1890, there was not a lot. There was infilling of wetlands, which happened really quite quickly, so a lot of those intertidal flats were changed and became dry land, and that changed the tidal prism. But other than that, we really pretty much left the estuary alone. From 1890 through to 1965, so 10 years after the Trevellyn Dam went in, we had a big dredging program. The Kanamaluka Tamar was the major transport route for a long time. You could get 70 kilometres inland if you could get things to the port up in Launceston. At its height, we were dredging about 160,000 cubic metres of sediment out of the upper estuary a year. But it was getting harder. The ships were getting bigger, they needed more draft. So it became economically unviable to keep dredging and to keep trying to get those big ships to Launceston. So that Port of Launceston moved to Bell Bay, and when they went to Bell Bay, the dredging stopped, pretty much. The Marine Board did a little bit of maintenance dredging. They did a bit of raking under really high flow scenarios, sort of 400 to 800 cumecs of water coming down the South Esk. They would do some raking. But other than that, it was largely left alone until 2012. And in 2012, we had sediment raking to try and tackle the problem of the mud flats and to try and make the foreshore look better. Sediment raking had 3 key performance indicators, with the primary performance indicator being the net loss of sediment from the upper estuary. The Flood Authority were probably rightly concerned that with the consolidation of the mud flats, that would take up volume within the estuary bowl, and if a big flood came through, then we might overtop our levees. So there was real focus on having a net loss of sediment out of the upper estuary, so that if a flood came through, there was space for the water, because we've taken so much of the space for the water by building on it. There were 2 other KPIs: improved visual amenity, so people don't like mud flats, don't like looking at them, and improved usability of the river as reported by regular river users. It was conducted under a Parks and Wildlife grant of authority, because most of the Kanamaluka Tamar is a conservation area. So it requires a reserve activity assessment and a grant of authority from Parks and Wildlife to be able to undertake activities there. The permit expired, the 5-year permit expired in May 2018, and then the Parks and Wildlife, in consultation with the EPA, issued a 12-month extension to that permit with a review clause built in. In 2013, the original grant of authority had a sediment raking monitoring plan that had to include details of monitoring to assess the success of raking and a monitoring strategy to assess the potential impact on the receiving environment. And then in 2018, we got the condition that we would have to provide a review of the data collected under that monitoring plan to the EPA and to Parks and Wildlife. So that was what we've been doing for the last 12 months. If you've followed silt raking, sediment raking, I always use sediment, not silt, because silt is just one fraction of the sediment component. There's also clays, gravels, sands, all those others. So I always use sedimentation, not silts. But if you've followed the sedimentation silt raking program, this would be the sort of chart you might be used to seeing. So the blue line is sediment volume within the upper yacht basin, which is this piece in here. So this is sediment volume going up and down. The pink bars are the raking periods. The green and blue down the bottom is the inflow of the North and South Esk River coming in, so we can track what's happening with the flow. And we've got a little bit of dredging over here on the end. And so it looks all right. It looks like when we rake, sediment volume goes down. This is the June 2016 flood, which was a 1 in 200 year event for the North Esk, but a 1 in 50 year event for the South Esk, which is a much bigger proposition, a lot more water. 200,000 cubic metres of sediment was washed out of the upper estuary, out of the yacht basin in those months from June 2016 to September. Huge volumes, but huge volumes of water came through too. And we can see before silt raking, we can see that when we had high flow, volume went down. But it's trending pretty steadily back up again, because that's the nature of this system. It's an equilibrium between the sediment and the water and the chemistry and the wave action and all those things interacting together in the upper estuary. When we looked at the data a little bit more closely, we divided the estuary up into sort of deeper channels, the darker bits through the middle, and then the mudflats. And so if we look, zone 3 is this big western shoal here. It was really targeted during the raking program. And we can see that with the blue line, that really falls with raking. Like it trends up, but raking really works for that mudflat. But if we look at the navigation channels, so zones 2 and zone 4, what we find is that raking, it has a little bit of an effect, but it's always been trending up. Ever since we started raking under this program, sediment volume's been trending up. We had the knockout effect of 2016 floods, but really coming back strongly. And the same with zone 4, tucked down here at the bottom. Zone 4 never went down, and the June 2016 floods was not enough to move the sediment that had accumulated in this channel during the raking program. So a 1 in 50 year event for the South Esk River was not enough water to restore the navigation channel in here. So not necessarily improved navigation, because we lost our channels. We just lost the shipping channels as part of the program. Prop washing became part of the silt raking program for Seaport, but there was no other easy way to deal with the sediments in Seaport. People don't like seeing the marina stranded at low tide. The way it works, where the vessel can't get, they use a digger to dig the sediments out from inside the floating marina and put it on the outside. And then the boat would tie up and turn its engines on and create turbulence and flow and jet the dirty water out through there. And it works. Yeah, we prop wash Seaport Marina. We get 3 metres of water under the marina. The boats are floating at low tide, and everybody's happy. But we have to do this every 2 years at least. 2 years is just about as long as you could get away with, and you would have to go back and do the whole thing over again. And this is sort of a heat map of what happened to the bathymetry when we tested it. We did a survey halfway through the prop washing program earlier this year in May. So this was the bit that had been prop washed. So green is deeper and dark green is deepest, and red is shallower water. So 2 weeks of prop washing got us floating, lots of water here under these first 2 berths. We had a lovely island of sediment built up here under the third. We've got a nice barway built up here and a depositional zone out here off Town Point. And by the time we had finished the prop washing program and worked all the way through all those berths, this barway and this depositional zone through here were such that you couldn't access the marina at less than half tide at all, because you would run aground. And at less than half tide, the guys that run the commercial tourism venture here, they could go neither north nor south because they couldn't get out of there. They couldn't get off their pontoon because we had deposited so much sediment. And this is what we ended up with. So March 2019, that was before that prop washing. We can see we've got water over the mudflats, but we've got no channel. And this is the tourist boat. It's got a 1.1 metre draft and it's run aground. So we didn't achieve improved navigability for regular users. The permit required us to look at local water quality, which is what we did. So there was some data collected. There was a 3,500% increase in total suspended sediments. You would expect sediments to go up, but a 3,500% increase is quite a lot. It makes all these other numbers look really quite small, but we got a 400% increase in total phosphorus, a 100% increase in total nitrogen. A 2,500% increase in titanium, 900% increase in zinc between upstream and downstream. Prop washing and sediment raking has had a very large impact on the local water quality. It's extremely high suspended sediments, extremely high nutrients, and the monitoring program wasn't designed to let us look at the broad scale impacts that we should have been assessing for an estuary in a conservation area. We didn't know what the consequences of the water quality impacts would be downstream or how far they were going. But that was the sort of water quality impact that we were getting. That's what a 3,500% increase in total suspended sediment looks like. It's chocolate milk through here, really, and then you've got the South Esk water coming out through the tail race in the bottom. So NRM North, we had a working group, and NRM North, through Rebecca Kelly, crunched a lot of the data from their broad scale monitoring program. And what we found was that if there'd been any raking in the previous week, we had suspended sediments, turbidity, ammonia, total and dissolved phosphorus increasing all the way through to almost to Hillwood. If there'd been raking in the previous 2 weeks, we saw NOx all the way to Clarence Point. We stopped analysing the data at Clarence Point because we figured if we were getting an impact at Clarence Point, there was an impact everywhere. So NOx was up across the entire estuary. Total suspended solids and total phosphorus remained high in the upper estuary. Dissolved reactive phosphorus and ammonia stayed high through the middle of the estuary. So we're sort of seeing this pulse in the totals in the upper and mid estuary, and then the dissolved fraction further downstream as it's had time to, the contaminants have had time to detach from the sediment. So broad scale water quality impacts as a result of raking, and it was assessed against flow and other factors as well to see if there were correlations with, was something else causing it, and high flows were actually protective for the water quality. So if we raked when there was more water coming down the South Esk, then the water quality impact was lower. And again, with the metals, we didn't have very much data for metals, but the data that we did have showed us that total metals in this upper mid-estuary were raised if there was raking in any of those periods. So 21 days ago we did some silt raking, you would have increases in total zinc all the way to Hillwood. So we go back to those key performance indicators. There was no net loss of sediment from the upper estuary. We've got a lot of sediment still out there, and we're trending to get back to where we were before we started. There's improved visual amenity if it's measured as the net reduction of shoals at low tide. Certainly at Seaport, sometimes on the West Tamar, it doesn't last very long, but you do get it. Improved usability of the river, we didn't achieve that KPI either. So off the back of that, the sediment raking program was discontinued. Sediment raking as a tool is potentially still an option under the right conditions, and that's sort of 800 cumecs of water coming down the South Esk River. Then it's potentially an option, but a raking program where we just are out there raking for 10 or 12 days on outgoing tides, we're not doing that anymore. So we need to get to a where to from here. And we need to understand and we need to balance out the different community needs. We have rowers, we have tourism, we have fishery people, we have threatened species. We've got the geomorphology of the system that we need to be mindful of as well. And then we need a community education campaign, which is partly why I'm talking to you guys tonight. Our options, are these. Business as usual, that's not an option. A modified raking program where we have defined flow limits and timing and priority areas, that's an option, but it's not a feasible option. You need a lot of water coming down. It's not a predictable thing. You can't have somebody on standby with a vessel. So a modified raking program is not really an option. Do nothing is an option. The system will sort itself out with time. We know that the way that the wave energy works in the upper estuary, we will end up with a channel and with mudflats, and we will get a system of equilibrium again. Whether we're prepared to wait for that is probably the question. We know that we have people running aground now, and we know that the raking program has created a problem that didn't exist before. We've lost our navigation channel, and talking to operators on the water, they didn't used to run aground even at low tide. There was always channel depth. So we need to do something else. At the moment, we've got GHD looking at options for us. In 2009, we had quite an extensive sediment management options paper drawn up. We now have GHD as consultants coming in and helping us update that plan with the new data that we've collected over the last 6 or 7 years and understanding what we've got. What we think we're probably looking towards is some short-term dredging, because we've lost the navigation channel. We're impacting on people's businesses, and we're impacting on people who like to row and get about out there in boats. So we're looking at the option of a short-term dredging program to try and restore those navigation channels. And then we're looking to some foreshore and intertidal wetland remediation. It would, nothing would probably please me more than to see some of our low-lying areas inundated with water again. That's quite a big project. But we can, with the foreshore and intertidal wetland remediation, there's some low-hanging fruit. We've got the West Tamar, so there's a lot of weeds, and there's a lot of, it's not a nice looking thing at low tide. There are ways that we could make that look tidier, which would be more pleasing to the eye. We can plant reeds and revegetate and stabilise some of that tea tree. So there are options, but we have to be realistic. So something like this, with a foreshore remediation program, that's something that is achievable for Launceston. We would have reeds that would end up down on the edge of a mudflat, which would then go to the water. But something like this is just not achievable. We're not going to have white sand and we're not going to have clear blue water. That's not the system that we live on. We live on an intertidal mudflat on a floodplain, and the water's brown, and we don't have enough dye to make it blue like that one. And I don't know, with rising sea level, I'm not convinced I'd want to live in any of those houses, let alone if a storm came through. So we have to be reaching for something that's achievable. And that's where we're hoping to go. That's it. Thank you. Sorry.